All right, we're now recording, and it is noontime. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar, Protecting Yourself and Others on the Farm. I'm Shannon Dill, and I will be facilitating the session. Throughout this presentation, we will be using the chat pod for questions. Please use the arrow keys to select everyone and type your question, and the presenter can answer that question as soon as they're able. We'll also have time for questions at the end of the webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors and collaborators. They're here listed on the right-hand side of this slide, and remind you of our upcoming webinars. We have 2 a month. So in April, we'll be talking about estate and transition planning, as well as predator control for your small flock. And later this month, we'll be talking about soils and salts, from fertilizers to tidewater. So big variety of topics we have for this spring session. As a reminder, we will be recording today. An email will be sent directly to you with the link to the archive presentation and any materials presented. Please feel free to share this email with your colleagues. And then also our complete collection of archive webinars are found here on this blue link. Our archive webinars as well as our upcoming webinars. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Nia Little and Sarah Everhart. They'll be introducing themselves and what they do with the University of Maryland.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah,
I'm going to share my screen to get to the slides. So I guess I'll introduce myself first. My name is Nia Little. I am a UMD Extension Agent in Urban Agriculture based in Baltimore.
And I am Sarah Everhart. I'm the Managing Director of the Agriculture Law Education Initiative at Maryland Carey Law School.
I'm going to get us started today. We're here to talk about protecting yourself and everyone else on your farm. And I really appreciate you coming and spending an hour learning about this topic. I'm going to start off our presentation, and then Sarah's going to pick it up. I'm really glad we've been able to work together on this. It's been a great opportunity to combine her awesome legal knowledge with getting to work with the farmers that I've worked with, and I think it is a useful topic for you. So I know there are a couple of slides that Sarah's going to start off with.
Yeah, thank you, Nia. So as I said, I work for the Agriculture Law Education Initiative, and just in case you're unfamiliar with us, we are a collaboration between the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the University of Maryland College Park, and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. We are a group of lawyers, and our job is to provide legal research, education, and outreach to Maryland farmers. So we have a website where many of our legal resources are housed, and that's umaglaw.org. We're on social media, so I've given you our social media information there. And if anyone has any questions about this topic or any other legal topics, they can feel free to email us at umaglaw@umd.edu, and then my email and phone number will be on the last slide today. I have to give a little disclaimer. Since I am a lawyer, I just want to make it abundantly clear that today is just for educational purposes, so I'm not going to be providing anyone with legal advice. If you need legal advice, you should consult your individual attorney.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate her taking those slides. She did a much better job with them than I would have. So let's dive in. Today we're going to talk in particular about the worker protection standard. There's a lot of aspects to farm safety, and I'm really glad that you're here and interested in it. But today we're going to focus in on this one topic that is a piece of farm safety, and that's the worker protection standard. It's a federal law that was issued by the Environmental Protection Agency to protect farm workers, specifically from the effects of exposure to pesticides, but making sure you're in compliance with it has benefits for both any workers you have and for yourselves if you are the sort of the lead farmer on the farm. And I want to jump right into why should you care? Because when we say worker protection standard, that sounds a little dry and distant and legal, and it is important from a legal perspective. This is a federal law that you're required to be in compliance with as a farmer if you have employees, and if you're using pesticides that have a label that mentions the worker protection standard, and I'll point out in a couple slides where that shows up. But it's also really important for your health and your farm workers' health. There's been some really cool population level studies of farmers and their families over a long period of time that have found that following good, pesticide best management practices, best safety practices, does have really important health benefits, reducing the risk of working with these tools long-term over your life. So these are the kinds of things that you should be doing anyway, and documenting that you're doing them is what you need to do to make sure you're in compliance with this federal law. And I mention it in particular because I've worked on a couple of small-scale organic farms. I work mostly with small-scale farmers, and often the farmers that I work with do not use the restricted use pesticides that require you to have a certified pesticide applicator license. So sometimes it might not be obvious to people that the worker protection standard applies to them because, I might have thought, or some farms I work with might have thought, well, I'm not using the dangerous pesticides, so I don't need to worry about this law. You might not even have learned about it because we usually talk about it at the pesticide certification classes. But even organic pesticides, such as in this picture we've got kaolin clay on cucumbers to keep off cucumber beetles, even organic pesticides often require compliance with the worker protection standard. And they all pesticides, whether they're organic or conventional, regardless of acute toxicity, require safety precautions, and you need to follow the label. Even clay is a risk of breathing it in too much and causing damage to your lungs just from the physical abrasion of the very small particles of clay. So it's really important not to get complacent when you're working with pesticides that might have less of an acute toxicity, but still can cause you health problems long-term from chronic exposure. So it's still important to think about. The worker protection standard, like we mentioned, is a federal law. Using any pesticide in violation of its labeled recommendations is a federal law violation. And here in this slide, you can see an example of the kind of box that most labels have on pesticide products that mentions the worker protection standard. It's usually in the agricultural use requirements. It's usually in this little box. Sometimes you'll have to look elsewhere on the label, and it says that you need to use this product only in accordance with the label and with the worker protection standard. And this is actually from the kaolin clay that I mentioned earlier. When you use a product that has this on it, then you need to know that you need to comply with the worker protection standard. And mostly what the worker protection standard talks about is your responsibilities as an employer. So even if you're a small-scale farm with maybe seasonal AmeriCorps volunteers, even if you're a nonprofit farm, there are some responsibilities you have to those folks who are coming and working on your farm to do your best to protect them from the risk of illness and injury resulting from exposure to the pesticides that you use. This law has been recently revised in 2015, and the effects of those changes came into effect in January 2018, so there has been some renewed interest in this law recently. There's a couple definitions you need to understand. The law mentions workers and handlers, and when it talks about workers, that means the people who are not necessarily using pesticides, but are working in places where they might be exposed to them. So say you yourself spray the clay on the cucumbers, and then you have a summer worker who comes and harvests the cucumbers later. That's a worker, that summer employee. You then are the handler. If you hire someone to spray the clay, then they would be an employee who is a handler. Your responsibility as an employer is to make sure that anyone working on your farm, these workers and handlers receive training, safety training every year, and there is documentation requirements for that as well. You also need to make sure you train the workers before they enter any area that's been treated with a pesticide, and this is where those restricted entry intervals from the label become very important as well. You want for yourself to make sure you read the label and see what the restricted entry interval is, and then educate your employees on understanding that there's a certain period of time after you use a pesticide when you're not supposed to go back in. Anyone who handles pesticides need to be trained before using pesticides. That's pretty obvious, but it's something that you need to make sure that you're doing. There are some requirements on who can deliver worker protection standard training. The easiest, most common thing is that anyone who has a current pesticide applicator license is considered trained enough to deliver the worker protection standard training to employees. If you do not have a pesticide applicator's license, say you're an organic farmer, or you just don't use those restricted use pesticides that require you to have a pesticide applicator license, there are a couple of alternatives. You can have the training be delivered by someone who's completed an EPA-approved Train the Trainer program. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a link that has information on how you can take one of those Train the Trainer programs. Or someone who's been designated as a trainer by a state, federal, or tribal agency. So I think the middle bullet is probably going to be relevant to most of you. This website, PERC, Pesticide Educational Resources Collaborative, has free EPA-approved training materials. And I did get confirmation from the Maryland Department of Agriculture that if you go through the materials and you teach them to someone, that counts kind of as getting the Train the Trainer. So if you read through what they've got on the website and you deliver that training, double check, but I believe that would work for the training. Then, Sarah, did you want to jump in? Are you getting ready?
No, you can go ahead.
All right, this is my last slide, I think. And as I mentioned, there are record-keeping requirements that go along with the training. It's not enough just to train your employees, and you also need to keep records of the fact that you've trained your employees, and this is kind of where the covering your butt part of this comes into play. You need to keep records for 2 years at least of the trainee's name, and they need to sign it. The date of training, and evidence of your qualification to train them. That's your pesticide applicator license, or the information about how you took the Train the Trainer course. And then you also need to keep track of the employer's name and the number of the EPA number for the training materials that you used. So I know this looks like a lot on a slide, but it's not that bad. And it's really important to show that you are offering these required trainings for your employees. And now I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, and she's going to dig in a little bit deeper.
Sure. Thanks, Nia. So as we discussed, certified pesticide applicators and certified crop advisors, they're exempt from having to receive that worker and handler training. So because they would be qualified to be trainers themselves, if you have those folks on your farm as either workers or handlers, they don't have to sit through the annual training. However, it'd be a very good idea for you to make sure you have documentation that they are still a currently certified pesticide applicator or crop advisor. So get a copy of that certification and maintain it for 2 years so that you could prove that if you ever had that question come about. The next thing we're going to talk about is family. And so important to understand, there are partial exemptions for immediate family members. So the exemptions in the worker protection standard context are for people, not for the farm. So you have to analyze each person Farm owners and their immediate family are exempt from some of the worker protection standard training requirements, not all. And I highlighted immediate family there because you got to be careful. There is a careful definition, or I guess I should say a narrow definition of immediate family. So pesticide training, safety training for workers and handlers, there's an exemption for that, although I think it would be best practice to put even your immediate family through that. Providing information on where to find the safety poster and some of the other information, and then mitigation steps that we'll talk about in detail in a few more slides here, and then training for equipment used in pesticide handling activities. So just for those folks who are farm owners or immediate family members. So no agricultural establishments that use worker protection standard covered pesticides, all those pesticides Neith was talking about, are completely exempt from the worker protection standard requirements. So even owners and their immediate family members who qualify for the exemptions have to comply with certain requirements. So there's never a total exemption. And owners of farms must still provide all of the required worker protection standards and protections for anyone on the farm that is not an immediate family member. So let's talk about exactly what you need to do. We've talked about training, which is a very important component of this, but the other employer responsibilities can be broken down into the need to inform and protect workers and handlers about pesticide safety, and then the need to mitigate exposures if they occur. So to inform your workers and handlers, you first need to train them, as we've talked about. You need to provide access to specific information, including the pesticide applications that have taken place on the farm, safety data sheets for pesticides applied on the establishment, and pesticide safety information. So there is an updated worker protection standard poster that was one of the changes in the law that we talked about that came into effect January 2018. So if you have an old poster on your farm, be a very good idea to make sure you get the most up-to-date poster so it includes all the information that needs to be included. You need to provide access to the labeling information for the handlers and the workers. So they need to be able to read those labels that we were talking about before. If you're using pesticides with the label, you have to provide your workers and handlers access to that label so that they can make sure they're following all the precautions. And you need to notify the workers about treated areas so they can avoid inadvertent exposures to pesticides. So to protect, you have to keep the workers and other people out of the areas being treated with pesticides. Specifically, you have to keep them away from pesticide application equipment during applications, require handlers to suspend applications if workers or people are near pesticide application equipment, and you have to keep workers out of areas under a restricted entry interval, an REI, with a few narrow exceptions. So you need to protect workers who are doing tasks in the treatment areas during an REI, including special instructions and duties related to the correct use of personal protective equipment, monitor handlers using highly toxic pesticides, provide and maintain required personal protective equipment, and specifically if a respirator is required, you have to provide the handler with some information and training so that they can properly be using that respirator. And then you have mitigation responsibilities. So on the farm, you have to provide decontamination supplies, water, soap, towels for routine washing and emergency decontamination, and eye wash systems for certain handlers. And then if an exposure does occur, you need to provide emergency assistance by making transportation available to a medical care facility, and then providing the medical care responders with information about the applicable pesticides that were involved. So some more employer responsibilities. You need to ensure, if you're the employer, that your early entry workers and handlers are at least 18 years old. And again, you would need documentation and keep it for the requisite amount of time. I would keep it for at least 2 years, proving that those folks were 18 when they had those responsibilities. And keep in mind that you cannot retaliate against a worker or handler who attempts to comply with the worker protection standard. You know, if that's something that you were trying to get them to not do, if they file a complaint or if they provide information in an investigation of noncompliance with the worker protection standard. So those are legal, those are laid out in the law and things that you are legally not able to do for a worker or a handler. So this is a very complex area, I would say. There's a lot of different responsibilities, and Neeth and I have tried to kind of hit the highlights here with you, but there's a lot more information that can be gathered, and here's some good sources for that. So the EPA's Pesticide Worker Safety website and that PERC, the Pesticide Educational Resources Collaborative that Neeth referenced before. We gave you that website there, and then the Maryland Department of Agriculture's Pesticide Regulation section. So we gave you their phone number as well because they also can provide some really good information for you. We can also try to answer any other questions you have. So here is our contact information. And if anyone has any questions they'd like to type into the chat box, we're happy to try to field those to the best of our ability now.
All right. Questions for Sarah or Neeth?
Awesome. That was a lot faster for all that information than I expected we'd get through. I also wanted to tell a story while people are thinking of their questions. This is something I learned about when I was a student, and I know sometimes professors or educators who have students working in agricultural research need to comply with this rule as well, and sometimes might not be aware of that. So that's if you have students who are working in an agricultural setting, this is also something that is relevant to you, and it's amazing that how much that early education sticks. I think good safety practices is something that you should be including in your curriculum. It's a part of what you're educating the students in as well.
Sarah, how state by state are these, or these are federal regulations?
Yeah, federal law, so it's going to be the same standard across the country. States typically can enact more restrictions, more worker protections, so that may be done on a state-by-state basis, but this is the federal law is kind of the minimum and the standard that everybody has to comply with, unless your state has enacted more restrictive protections.
Okay, so we've got a question coming in here. Let's see. In medicine, drugs can sometimes be used for other diseases that were not the original target. Can pesticides be used for other diseases and crops not originally the target for a pesticide?
That's a very good question. I think Sarah might have some stuff to say on this, but I just wanted to say, again and again, the label is the law. So you're not supposed to use a pesticide that says it's for cucumber beetles and try to use it to control cabbage loopers. I think there are some parts of the label that it is a law, but that's kind of like a warning on you too, right? Like If the label says it controls cucumber beetles and you try to use it to kill cabbage loopers, don't expect it to work. Sarah, did you want to add anything on that?
No, I mean, I would agree with that. I think, it's the label, start with the label, use it in accordance with the label, and, anytime you're using it, definitely in a way or in a proportion that's different from the label, I think you're running the risk of potentially violating the law.
And
I know that's a challenge for folks. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I know that's a challenge for folks growing unusual crops, specialty vegetables. Sometimes specialty vegetable associations do a lot of lobbying to try to get appropriate recommendations for their vegetables on pesticide labels because if not a lot of people grow it, the companies might not have a lot of incentive to figure out what the appropriate use is on those vegetables and get that onto the label. So I know this is a challenge, and also for researchers, but it is definitely something you need to work through.
And that is whether it's on purpose or accidental, the label is still the law. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Other questions? What are the repercussions for violating the law?
Yeah, that's a good question. Anytime you're dealing with a federal law, it's going to depend on what the violation was, whether the violation was intentional, whether this was your first violation of the law. And I think it's going to depend where you fall in sort of the framework of this whole thing. So if you're a certified applicator or a crop advisor, you run the risk of, at a minimum, losing that certification. And then there's also potential civil penalties involved. And that, the worst case scenario is that someone who's working for you or a family member who might, whether or not it's for pay, if they're on your operation helping you and they are injured, then you run the risk of a potential lawsuit from that person as well. So I think there's a lot of potential things that could happen, and that's just kind of outlining a few of them. If that person wants some more specific civil penalty type information, they can feel free to email me there and I can get them that information.
Mm-hmm. I think this is something I've talked in particular with farmers I've known who, I remember there was one farmer that I worked with who was an immigrant farmer and had some neighbors who were very unhappy about that. And when I sat down with them, I said, this is something I would like to encourage you to be sure you are in compliance with, because anytime you have someone like that who is making complaints against you, you want to make sure all of your ducks are in a row. So that's a situation where I would encourage you to double check that you're in compliance with things like this. And then, like we said, the health impacts are also really important. We know that chronic use of certain pesticides, they're useful tools, but chronic use of them is of certain pesticides, right? Not all. Different tools are different and have different risks, but certain pesticides have statistical associations with certain long-term health impacts. But this one study that I'm referencing did find that the farmers who used the safety precautions, who used the personal protective equipment, who followed the rules, that statistical association wasn't there. So that suggests something really hopeful to me, that if you treat these tools with respect, if you follow the safety precautions, if you use the best practices, then your risk of those health complications is not any different than the general population, at least from that study. So I think there's a lot of legal reasons why you need to do this, but there's also a lot of personal health reasons as well.
And it is treated like a court case. I know in our state in Maryland, if a formal complaint is issued, it's opened up like a regular court case. Okay. Other questions? Does the EPA then label a farm as non-compliant for a certain amount of time?
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but that's the kind of thing I'd be happy to answer if someone wants to email me that question.
I don't know that either. I imagine it might be something that the Maryland Department of Agriculture pesticide inspectors probably have the direct relationship with. I don't know at what point it advances to the federal level.
Yeah, generally in Maryland, the federal regulation is enforced through our Department of Agriculture. So there should be an agency in each state that is the enforcer of the federal regulation. Okay. Other questions? I'm going to go ahead at this time and go ahead and stop recording. Feel free to ask any other questions.